split you in half. So we both have the honor, and I introduced Dr. Olivia Wilkinson, who is the Director of Research at JRI and directs JRI's research work, collaborating with partners from UN agencies and governments such as UNICEF and UNHCR to faith-based organizations and NGOs, including Islamic Relief and World Vision, and in collaboration with universities such as University of Leeds and University College of London. And her research focused on the response to Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines for a PhD, and she has since conducted collaborative research work around the world, and most recently with local faith actors in South Sudan. Olivia, thanks for being here. Nora, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Eggard. So I will be introducing Dr. Jennifer Philippa Eggert. She is a researcher and practitioner specializing in violent conflict and development, and she has a focus on gender, faith, and local approaches. She has worked in different contexts like Europe, in the Middle East, South Asia, and the US, and she is currently a senior research associate at the Joint Learning Initiative on Faith and Local Communities, and a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Warwick. Welcome, Jennifer. I would like to hand over to our chairpersons, Jennifer and Olivia. And thanks everyone for being here and taking part of this roundtable.
Great, thank you so much, Nora, on behalf of Olivia and myself. It's great to know that you enjoy working with us, you at the RCSD. We love working with you guys too, so the appreciation is mutual. And we're really, really excited that we've had this opportunity to put together the roundtable today. The topic of the roundtable is something that's very dear to our heart at JLI, because this is what the JLI is all about. Exchange between researchers, be it in academia or the NGO world or beyond, and practitioners. So we are really excited when we were approached by RCSD about putting this roundtable together, and even more excited to have this fantastic roundtable of colleagues and friends from all over the world together. So let me share the presentation that Olivia and I have prepared, which will help us guide our way through the next hour and a half. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Yes, okay, fantastic. So, so we want to speak with you today about knowledge exchange, about policy, practice, and research, all in the context of development and research. And this is the outline of the session as we have planned it. We're in the short introduction that I'm doing right now. After that, Olivia will take over and say a little bit about the experience of the JLI in this area of knowledge exchange between research, practice, and policy. And then after that, we'll have a discussion amongst our 5 amazing panelists, all from research and practice themselves. We have 2 questions for them. They would like to them to respond to, and then after that there will be an opportunity for the panelists to respond to each other's contributions, and then after that you guys in the audience will probably be itching to also chip in and contribute to the discussion, and you will then get an opportunity to do just that, and we have around half an hour in the end for that. So, without further ado, I'm handing over to Olivia.
Thank you, Jennifer. Yes, we went just straight into the next slide there, and we're, I hope you'll allow us to kind of take our co-moderator's privilege to present a little bit first about the JLI's experience in this area, because this idea of transdisciplinary knowledge exchange in religion and development is exactly the field that we work in and live in our working lives on a day-to-day basis. So I'll just take 10 to 15 minutes or so now to present. The first slide and the first thing to say is a little bit more about our aims overall. And our aims have changed over time. So JLI has existed since 2012. And when we first started, the aim was pretty much what's summed up in this initial column that you can see here around the evidence base. The idea was to grow the evidence, the so-called evidence base on religions and development, to help establish it further, to help it gain legitimacy, to further knowledge exchange between researchers, practitioners, and policymakers, and to synthesize, convene, and generate new evidence. So that was the initial aims of JLI. As we've gone forward in time, I think that we've started to understand that we're a growing network. There's now over 800 members. We're an international network with members from all over the world. And the shift that therefore we're seeing is building towards something that has a little bit more of a focus on perhaps addressing some of the power dynamics that we see in our worlds. On one hand, so really working for and around the fact that we have the title local faith communities in our very name, and we need to live into that a bit more. And then also understanding that, especially in this last year with COVID, we've seen a real rush to faith engagement from a lot of organizations that perhaps haven't done faith engagement so much before. They've seen the opportunity for working on health messaging with religious leaders, for example, and therefore thought about faith engagement in new ways, but that faith engagement has not always been of the best quality and has in fact stepped into and furthered some of the challenges that we've seen in faith engagement over the years, such as instrumentalization, etc. So the strategic religious engagement is what we're hoping to, and we're working on more and more at the moment, to help advance the way that faith engagement happens. And that really needs to be evidence-based. So it needs to be based on that first column, because as we know, there is a currency around evidence in the development world. You know, evidence has power, evidence is something that's demanded in a lot of strategies, that the work that's being done by in new projects is evidence-based. Now, what that actually means in reality, we can debate, and I think that might be part of what is happening in what is this transdisciplinary knowledge exchange, what is a real evidence base in something. But having said that, we do think that there is a substantial evidence base in our field of religions and development, and it does speak to how UN agencies, for example, should be doing their faith engagement. And we're trying to be that bridge for some of the UN agencies to make sure that they build their strategic religious engagement or faith engagement based on what we know from the evidence of other experiences in faith engagement and how to do it well. And then just the fair and equitable piece around how we think of all the power dynamics. So there are power dynamics in every level of what we look at in terms of religions, development, and evidence. Each of those areas has, we need to do a power analysis. But particularly, I just want to bring up, because we're talking about research and knowledge, the power dynamics of evidence. So I think we really see who sets the agenda of what's important evidence in development. And one of the big pushes that we always experience in this religion and development field is that it gets criticized as not having the right kind of evidence. We've not been able to produce the right kind of evidence, which usually revolves around an idea that it needs to be quantitative, and this expectation that we're going to be able to prove or put forward this final one figure that shows that it makes a 50% difference to do faith engagement. You know, I'm just pulling that out of thin air. And I think while we may be able to say that on some context-specific levels, certainly for an organization like JLI, where we're trying to be that bridge or broker between research and policy and practice, I often find myself pushing back against the idea that there is the right kind of evidence, and actually saying, well, when you're looking at religions and religions in development, really, you know, we need to be open to different ways of people describing and situating their religious experience in development that might not fit into some of the development evidence paradigms otherwise. So that would be something I'd be interested to hear more about. Can we go to the next slide, please, Jennifer? I think this slide has a lot of text, I'm sorry, but just to say that you know, if you look at the main things in blue here, and if you're familiar with any of JLI's work, you know, we've been trying this whole time since 2012 to do this knowledge exchange between research and practice. And I think that we've had successes and some failures, of course, and we've also changed over time. So this slide I want to bring up for the rest of the panelists and discussants, this idea of how. So the first slide I was wanting to talk about the content, and now I want to talk about how we do the knowledge exchange. So we relied initially on a lot of synthesis, doing these scoping studies where we brought together a lot of information across different topics, all on religion and development. You know, but the problem is, very simply put, 60-page reports are not a good communication tool when you're speaking to some of these policy makers. And that's what we were doing initially, thinking that the evidence would speak for itself. Some of the other research communications, convening conferences, for example, webinars, etc. There are standard methods that we can talk about there, are all very helpful. We've also found that doing new research or creating, for example, policy briefs that are exactly on a trend or speaking to a moment in the humanitarian development worlds is helpful. So, for example, we did a piece of research on the triple nexus just when it was becoming a trend. We were able to bring together a lot of our faith-based organization members to put in joint recommendations for the Global Compact on Refugees when it was in its consultation process. So it's about not necessarily always generating new evidence, but being confident that at the moment that a trend comes up, we can very quickly speak into that with the background of all the evidence that we've been, you know, thinking about over the years. And now I think we're increasingly stepping into the fact that translating the evidence into training packages, etc., is something that we need to look into more and more. And of course, there's all education systems like RCSD, etc., that have been doing education on religion and development for many years. But now the question is, how do we do that specifically for development staff? Okay, next slide, just my final slide to bring up all our thoughts. So I've kind of said a few of these already, but very, very fundamentally, I think in this knowledge exchange between research and practice, we have found that providing the evidence alone is not enough. One of the things I'm actually going to speak about in my own paper presentation later on today is this idea that we come from so many different disciplines in this subfield of religion and development. We come from global health, economics. Some of us are theologians, some of us are sociologists. And it often means that it can be confusing for someone trying to get a grasp on, well, what does faith engagement mean? It's confusing for them to know which academics to get in touch with potentially, or how to boil all the information down into something that can be immediately useful. But again, the point that we should be moving on from this idea that as researchers, we're just trying to prove the added value of religion, which I think was something that was has been demanded of researchers from some of the policymakers, particularly that we've talked to over the years. And that, I think, that comes from challenging this idea of evidence as well, and the dominance of some of the the dominance of some of the development evidence paradigms, as I've said, to say that it's not about finding that perfect statistic that proves faith engagement is important, but it's about being able to present in a short and concise way the complexity of faith engagement, which is difficult, but is worthwhile. And I think with this move towards strategic religious engagement, hopefully we're going to get better at it. And it's taking a lot of the principles that, you know, if you come from religious studies, are really quite basic things, just explaining relatively clear and well-known ideas about some of the key principles of religious literacy, for example, can be helpful. But I think that that's important. And then I think increasingly we're interested in hearing more and more about the ways in which knowledge and learning is conceptualized differently. I think I would say as a self-critique, JLI has been trying to speak to, you know, Western development practice and evidence, defined practice and evidence previously in our existence. And we're considerably shifting in the last couple of years to think through, and we have more shifts to make to think through what is evidence and learning and knowledge, you know, these ideas as defined by the communities that we're actually working with and for, and that will be different to the development evidence paradigms. That's where I'm going to end. I hope that that has given a quick picture of some of JLI's experience. I've summed up, you know, 8 years of work, but I hope that it will also maybe tune into some of what our panelists want to say as well, or maybe provide some provocation, not too provocative, but some ideas for you to speak on as well. Okay, Jennifer, thanks. Back over to you.
Olivia, I always find it so fascinating to listen to Olivia speaking about the work of the JLI. I've been with the JLI for a bit more than half a year, but Olivia has worked with them for years. And yeah, it's just so fascinating to hear how the work has evolved and the thinking has developed. And I'm now actually really curious to hear what our panelists, our amazing panelists, think about these issues. And we just go to the next slide. I will briefly introduce them. I went by alphabetical order, so there's no complaints later on. But why did she get to go first? Why did I come second? So first of all, we have Anupama Ranawana join us. She is a researcher with Christian Aid at the moment, has extensive experience both as an academic and as a practitioner, and a truly interdisciplinary background in both a theologian and a political economist. Our second panelist is Katherine Kraft, who is a research advisor in faith and development with World Vision International and a lecturer in international development at the University of East London. So she truly has a foot in both worlds and is both an academic and a practitioner. And the same can be said of Lincoln Lau, who represents the ICM and the University of Toronto here today. Lincoln joins us from the Philippines. He's research director of ICM, International Care Ministries, and an assistant professor at the University of Toronto. Nora Khalaf-Elledge is a postdoc at Goldsmith, also in London. She has also worked as a practitioner for many years, and her area of focus is religion, gender, and development. And then last, but certainly not least, Sarah Makievich from Humboldt-Universität at Berlin. Also a consultant with a focus on religion, dialogue, and peace building. So again, someone who, like all the other panelists, has extensive experience of working as a researcher and a practitioner, and really, really excited to hear from our panelists. We'll have a first round where we would like the panelists to focus on the following 2 questions. I won't read them out now, you can see them all in front of you. We said we'd give panelists 5 minutes, but then you're all researchers, and we know how researchers are, they like to talk. So if you could try and stick to 3 minutes, that will give us a little bit of wiggle room to make sure that we stay within the time limit. So Anu, would you like to go first, and would you like to share your reflections on these 2 questions?
Yes, thank you so much, Jennifer and Olivia, and also Nora. It's great to be here. Always nice to be. I've spent my entire professional life talking about the importance of religion and working in international development. So it's sort of a double blessing to be here. Just to position myself a little bit, also, I'm very aware that I work for Christian Aid, which is a faith-based agency, but one that's very much embedded in secular development framings. The question you give us is so interesting, and there's so much to unpack, but being limited to 3 minutes, I'll just give you the sort of initial things I've been thinking about. And I've been thinking a lot lately, about the multiplicity of knowledge, the decolonial impetus that I think is also now taking over international development. There's a bit of a rush, right? There's so much buzzwordism in this field. And I think that what religious actors and religious thought in particular, in all its diversity, provides a real challenge to the rigors, the structures of development policy and practice. And what really comes often to mind to me every time I do a piece of work is how dynamic religions are, and how knowledge exchange ensures that the theory that informs policy and practice does not remain static, but there's a kind of a demand to be continually responsive to the beliefs, values, principles, and forms of worship that shape religion and development. In many ways, if we can engage robustly, faith, religious thought, and the work of religious actors becomes a key link for the centering of marginalized knowledges, for silences that appear not only in the sector, but also in academia, as we continue to kind of draw out knowledge from different forms of practice. Quite recently, I just concluded some work on the role of faith actors in responding to COVID-19. And there was a real challenge that came up from that work, because we did, in a sense, the research understood that we did not end up working, so international development actors didn't end up only working with the kind of regular faith actors or the traditional faith actors, but also engaged in a kind of a wide variety of faith actors. And I often was speaking to people who were using the word communal actor or traditional actor interchangeably with faith actor. And it really challenged also, how are we thinking and defining faith-based leadership? What does it really mean when the faith actor is also the communal leader? Or it's a group of female faith leaders, for example, who may not necessarily be clerical, but are creating these kind of cooperatives, informal cooperatives, and working through that to provide spiritual care and public messaging and so on. And so this was a very interesting kind of response to come back. And if you have to think, my role as a researcher is not only to collect the research, but then to also to advise program quality on what we're seeing. So there's this really interesting power dynamics of who is a recognized faith actor as well that we start to think about. So those are sorry. All right. Yeah, those are for the thoughts at the top of my head, but happy to continue the discussion thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Anu. Some really interesting reflections there, which I hope we'll be able to pick up again in the discussion. Thank you so much. So next up is Kathryn. Kathryn, do you want to share your thoughts on why knowledge exchange between research, policy, and practice is important, and maybe share some examples from your own work where such an exchange was fruitful or maybe challenging?
Okay, I will try, but for some reason, this question has very much brought me more to it. Every time I think about it, I think more about the exchange between religious actors and policy actors, and kind of feel like as academics, we interpret, we understand, we also set the tone, I think, for a lot of the assumptions that each party makes about each other. But I actually am not going to directly answer your question, because I think, to me, the knowledge exchange really that we need has to be between the religious actors and the development and policy people. And as academics, we kind of stand in between. And so where this thought took me is down a very interesting rabbit trail, which is so different from what Anu just shared, a completely different lens, which is thinking about the history of where this divide, the sacred secular divide, came from. And thinking, back to the colonial kind of conception of the world, where the colonizers were the development actors, and were also, if not themselves the missionaries, were the ones who accommodated the missionaries. And so there was this this integration of religion and development, and religious actors and the political actors and the policymakers and the development practitioners were intertwined. And then when that all ended, for probably very, very good reasons, the split was so dramatic, and religious actors kind of went in two ways. Either became rather secularized development actors, such as World Vision or Christian Aid, who still maybe had a religious wing, but kind of presented it in a way that was palatable to the secularists, to the people, anti-religion people. And then the others who kind of went down the road of, we work with the religious institutions, we're still doing the missionary enterprise, and development is not what we exist for. And where academia has stood in this is, I think that divide has been promoted by academics, because the sacred secular divide in academia kind of pre-exists that. We can go back easily 100 years to see, probably 150 years to see in the social sciences why religion was debunked. And of course, in academia now, we are also rectifying that. And so academia almost seems to be kind of pulling the tugboat, and the tugboat is these two disparate groups of people who used to be intertwined and are now once again learning to interact with one another. And so as academics, I guess I don't feel necessarily the need for that knowledge exchange myself, but to make sure that the words that I do and the research that I conduct and the venues in which I present that research promote the fact that those two groups have so much to learn from each other and to respect one another, rather than promote this further separation and division. So when I came to the question about examples, actually what I thought of was a completely different set of examples, which were very much about, I went through some World Vision data from the early days of the COVID response, and I found some, I'm just going to read them out real quickly, examples of collaboration between religious groups and government. So in Ethiopia, faith leaders collaborating with local government administration to carry out sanitation campaign. In Somalia, faith leaders working with the Ministry of Education to seek solutions to support students who couldn't access digital or radio lessons. Working with the Ministry of Health, Gender and Community Development to coordinate all key national faith leaders for a one-day prayer on COVID with the Prime Minister as the guest of honor. That was in Tanzania. in El Salvador, agreements between 35 national partners of the Alliance for Protection of Children and the Global Network of Religions for Children to advocate for caring for victims and reducing the spread of the virus in El Salvador. That's just a flavor of when that dialogue is promoted, the kind of really exciting engagement that we are seeing. And I'm going to stop there.
Great, thank you so much, Katherine. I knew we could count on you for some super interesting reflections, so thank you so much for that. Next up is Lincoln. Lincoln, what do you think about the topic? What are your thoughts?
Sure, thank you, Jennifer. Yeah, no, it's great. So I guess I'm the third speaker, and I already feel like when I reflected on this question, I'm in a whole different direction too. So I hope it's not too all over the place. But maybe first of all, I'll start by saying, I think my academic background is quantitative. I really come from, I did RCTs in my doctoral work. I did, vaccine, placebo-controlled trials. That's where I came from. And I wonder if that brings a whole different angle. And I totally agree with Olivia. It's unfortunate that there is such a, maybe too much emphasis on a certain kind of data as evidence right now. But I also recognize that myself, that's the kind of the research training that I received. So when I go into the field, I'm thinking as a quantitative researcher first, and then I'm trying to collaborate with other types of researchers. But when I started thinking about, the divide that exists between academia, policy and practice, and then religious organizations or religious institutions, I think I started reflecting on a cluster that I'm part of at the university in Toronto, and we're thinking a lot about implementation science right now and implementation research. And I think there's this recognition that even from our department being so quantitative, there was a gap between us and practice. There was a gap between the work we're doing and whether or not it can actually be used in programs that are implemented. And we're really trying to cross over and run research that is useful. And so when we add another component, suddenly that divide becomes a three-way divide. And how do we cross over all of these different divides? And I think when I was thinking about knowledge exchange, I started immediately also thinking about knowledge generation. And a lot of this it ends up being methodologically driven. And I think this is where it becomes apparent to me, at least in some of the projects that we've tried to do, we do speak such different languages. I think the different groups have maybe all this vocabulary that is unique and in our own fields that we understand best. And I think when it's been fruitful, projects that have worked well is being kind of passionate and gritty and willing to take the methodology or some angle that I think is going to work. So maybe me as a quantitative researcher, and the collaboration that I'm trying to do with practitioners and with, we work with local churches here in the Philippines, is there really is this need to be very pragmatic, but also be very passionate about taking what I think is one way of doing something, but then learning to translate it, learning to communicate it in a way that isn't filled with, difficult concepts about randomizations or cluster randomization and all of that, statistics, but how do we communicate the method so that it's understandable, so that it's easy to engage? Because I think that the pragmatic side of me really believes that we do need all of these groups to be working together to really tackle some of the really difficult questions or difficult problems we're trying to address here. And so, yeah, I think not just crossing that divide in terms of knowledge exchange, but also crossing that divide in terms of truly collaborative knowledge generation would be something that would be really interesting to think through. And I think I constantly reflect on how I think I come from a very narrow place, and I don't want to be always coming from a narrow place. But then maybe that's one lens to think through the implications of speaking, my language is quantitative, but then I don't want to be closed in the way that I approach collaborations. So yeah, those are just a few thoughts for me.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Lincoln. Super, super interesting, and lots of food for thought there for everyone, I think. Let's hear from Nora. Let's see what Nora thinks about all of this.
Thank you. Thank you so much for organizing this discussion and creating space to ask this important question. I also think about this a lot. And like the other panelists, I also have worked in both academia and as a practitioner. And I felt the lack of exchange between the two definitely more than once, especially when it comes to a subject like religion that is always changing, so little understood and so often misunderstood. I think that this exchange becomes honestly indispensable. And I could think of quite a few examples where I wish there was a better knowledge exchange, but I was trying to think of the easiest one just for this discussion today. And this one has to do with the amount of confusion that still exists over what constitutes a religious practice and what constitutes a cultural practice, and where does religion end and where do social norms begin? Is something religion or is something just patriarchy? Because these boundaries are incredibly blurred and they vary depending on who you ask. And this is a real struggle for practitioners who lack both time and training in religious literacy. And so here, I always found that a knowledge exchange between academia is very, very pressing. So I remember between academia and practice, of course, I remember writing up a project report at a headquarters of a multilateral development agency. And one day when I opened the reports after a review cycle, I found that a bunch of attributes that I had used were changed for the word religious. And that happened because the person who reviewed the report felt that the issues in question were not cultural or social, but simply and straightforward religious. And then the next person who reviewed the report was then concerned that about the number of times the term religion was used in the report, and then said that we really shouldn't be talking about religion all that much, and suggested that we actually take out entire passages of the report. And this was incredibly frustrating because it wasn't at all what academic literature would have suggested here. In this example, you can see that a better exchange between academia and practice could have ideally provided a deeper understanding of the complexity of religion by helping to navigate the diverse concepts that are associated with religion, and by understanding that religion is deeply embedded in cultural and social practices that don't have clear boundaries and that vary from place to place. But at the same time, the reaction of the second colleague, the one that was fearful of the amount of times religion was being used, also shows that academia too needs to listen more to development day-to-day practice, because it cannot just assume that the problems around addressing religion in development have simply to do with an issue of lack of knowledge. Because even when practitioners have the knowledge about religion, they might still be held back by an overall caution within their organization that directs them to sort of stay clear of religion because it's considered risky or controversial or political and whatnot. So there's really an opportunity for both sides to engage in mutual learning here. And at the end of the day, to me, this bridge between academia and practice has really always been about portraying a fuller picture about the complexity of people's lives and about including more people into the process of producing this picture. And this is why this knowledge exchange is so pressing, because it can really make development better. It can tell people's stories better. And there are too many damaging simplifications and generalizations, especially when it comes to religion. So when you do a better job at telling someone's story, what you're really doing is you're doing a better job at respecting that person's dignity. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Nora. Sie when I said we have an amazing panel together, that's what I meant. And we're not even all through it yet. There's one more, there's one more, there's one more. And that's Sarah. Sarah, do you want to share your thoughts?
Yes, absolutely. Though I have to say this is a bit of a hard act to follow, so bear with me. And also, I actually prepared 2 answers to this question because I also wasn't sure what direction it was going in. So we'll see if this is helpful at all. So I divided the question into the kind of 2 components, and I was firstly looking at why this knowledge exchange is important. And I highlighted for me kind of 3 core insights, and all of these reflections, they come from working with faith-based organizations in the Middle East and also working in interfaith dialogue for 10 years. So this sort of comes together. Firstly, acknowledging that religion has really not been given enough attention by development actors, and still not, who many of them follow secular agendas, and they can really have a blind spot when it comes to religion. So they're either not informed about religious, ethnic, or cultural dynamics of the areas they're working in, or even if their team on the ground is informed, unfortunately, they are often being handed a project which has been written in headquarters by somebody who does not have that adequate knowledge. So they are implementing something which is not appropriate to the context in which it's being served. And at the same time, weirdly, we all know that 84% of people worldwide identify as religious, and most of the areas where this development work is taking place are heavily religious. So this dialogue between academia and development practice and policy is essential to understanding the context and essentially doing good development work, which is the goal. And the third point there is that my experience in the Middle East working with FBOs was that people were often more trusting of religious actors than secular actors, even if it wasn't their own religion, because the religious context was more familiar than a non-religious or secular context. So this can really be leveraged, this dialogue between development and academia around the role of religion to make better projects, but also to build more trusting relationships and more familiar relationships with communities. And then I just wanted to share some experiences. So I actually experienced a very active exchange between academia and development policy and practice around religion when I was working in Iraq. Because it is such a religious context, there really is no discussion which doesn't involve religion in some way. So I was a member of the Peace and Reconciliation Working Group, and that was a coordination mechanism set up to help actors in the peace building and reconciliation sector. And it was there to help them coordinate and share knowledge and experience. And we were in an area of ethnic, religious hyperdiversity, which had also been under the control of the Islamic State, which was also a religious ideology. So religion was kind of at the core of what we were doing. And what I thought was great, and I think this is a real model, and I do think there's a kind of disconnect between this Western or secular actors talking about religion and development and being in a cluster system where religion and development is your kind of everyday experience. But it was set up bilingually to make it as inclusive as possible, to help local and international actors speak to each other. And they had presentations in every sitting about context monitoring and latest research findings. So everybody was keeping abreast of main developments. However, at the same time, what you noticed in this coordination mechanism is that you'd have these local context monitoring presentations, and then on a regular cycle, new development actors will come with their projects, which had been written by headquarters, which did not reflect this reality. So maybe just to give you one example, we noticed that most interventions funded by Western donors in areas formerly under ISIS focused on cities with displaced Christian or Yazidi populations. And other ethnic religious groups who were in equal or greater need of support actually received much less. So the Kakai, which is a very small ethno-religious group, reported that after the liberation of their area from ISIS, NGOs came and kind of left their villages because the name Kakai was not sexy enough for a donor or for an intervention, but persecuted Christian or persecuted Yazidi was much more familiar to the West and therefore much more sellable. So it was this very, and Muslim Arab had the same problem. There was a very close association with ISIS, and people didn't want to be associated with these victims who were still the religious perpetrators in the donors'
mind. So I found this a very interesting, it was an exchange and a meeting of academia and development actors. And I found like on the ground, there was certainly a core understanding of the issues, but there was a real disconnect feeding this back to the donors and to the host countries, the complexity. So I really agree kind of with what my predecessors have said. We need a common language, but we also need people to understand the context. And I think you guys are all doing great work in that regard. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Great first round, I would say. I mean, not just really insightful contributions, but actually our panelists pushing the boundaries of who we thought was going to be interesting. So we really appreciate it, and it's fantastic. That's exactly what you want in a good discussion, isn't it? Let's go for a second round now. We thought before we open up the discussion and include the audience, we thought we'd give panelists an opportunity to respond to each other's points. We do also have another question that we thought might be interesting in that context, but let me just share the slide. So it's this question here. Can you see that?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So the question of how can we improve knowledge exchange between academia, policy, and practice. Now, this is just an idea that we had, so don't feel compelled to respond to that. You can also just pick up any points that any of the other panelists have raised that you would like to respond to. Same rules of the game, 3 minutes for each of you. And then after that, we'll open up the discussion and give the rest of the audience an opportunity to also share their thoughts, make comments, or ask questions. So let's start with Anu. Anu, 3 minutes, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm trying not to respond like a theologian to your questions. I think I just wanted to be very clear that what I was really trying to say in my initial response was to talk about the importance of the multiplicity of religious actors and identity, and that what we have from this kind of diversity of knowledge allows us an understanding of what it means to be fully human, you know, to have full dignities. In that, I very much agree with what Nora was saying, and how important it is for that to be speaking to development policy and practice. And I think the academic plays an important role in being a conduit of sorts, right, of thinking about this and finding ways in which to be a kind of interlocutor between. And one of the things I also think tends to get lost, and this is really where academics, especially academics who have feet in all of the different sort of pies, can play an excellent role in opening up spaces of dialogue and knowledge exchange, is also to center not just a faith actor or religious actor and their activity, or their role, or the role and the importance. Because, for example, in COVID-19, I think we've also seen that the ability of the faith actor to be more trusted than the government actor has meant that there are some development practitioners who did instrumentalize that relationship, because if it's a pandemic, it's a rush, you have to respond very quickly, you need to find a trusted actor. There was an instrumentalization, but not really a recognition of the faith actor as a co-partner. And one of the reasons I think why that doesn't happen is also we don't really think of religious thought as important. And I do think that faith-based organizations do feed in from their, you know, theology or faith-based thinking into practice. But if we are going to bridge that divide between the secular developmental practice and religious actors, we also need to ensure that the religious thought and the religious thought of the communities that practice is also feeding into what that means to be to thrive, to survive. So I think that's also sort of a missing space. How do we make knowledge exchange better? I think one of the key spaces really is to encourage development practitioners and academics to center community knowledges, to shift. In what ways can we find to shift the gaze away from donors and government actors to the communities that we are we are working with? How can the communities, and very often they're not, as we've all said here, very faith-based communities design projects in a way, or design research, co-design research even, so that it really feeds, meets those needs. I think that kind of knowledge exchange is difficult to do. I'm currently in the midst of doing a collaborative research document, and it's taken about 3 months, and we still haven't signed off on the research design. But can we find the space and the time and the funding even to really do that kind of collaboration? So those are just the questions I have in my head. So it's not really an answer, but my questions, I suppose. Thank you.
Right, thank you so much, Anu. I'll hand straight over to Kathryn in the interest of time.
Okay, yeah, the time and space piece, I think, is so front and center. So I think that was a really great last word. I think the thing that, as I've been listening to each of my colleagues sharing, something that I'm not sure anybody has called out yet, but seems like an angle that is relevant to each of our perspectives is what questions are we as researchers, and now I have my academic hat on, asking. And I think if I stick with my image of, the academia as the tugboat carrying along the dialogue between the religious actors and the development policy community, I think we as researchers need to kind of give up a little bit that in which we are interested. And I think academically, there are some really, really interesting questions out there. And they tend, although not necessarily, to possibly resonate more with the religious community than with the development community. I'm not sure that's actually true, but that's my gut feeling. But they rarely resonate with both. And the development policy community very often does not know what to do with research results. I don't know how much research has been conducted on World Vision. And as the senior research advisor for faith and development at World Vision, I can't use it. It's great stuff. It's phenomenal. It's great, really good, incisive analysis, but it's just not relevant to any of World Vision's strategic priorities or directions or programming. And so I find that a lot of my time is spent working with academics to help them design research that they still find interesting and relevant and a contribution, but that it's also useful to meeting World Vision's needs. And the thing, though, that even with World Vision, I feel like I have, and this is where maybe the religious academic pool has to come a little stronger, is and I think Olivia was kind of starting to hint at this, is we need to get past this question of, does religion matter? We've answered that question. And does it work to partner with faith actors? We've answered that question. We can keep answering it, but to go deeper. What is it about genuine faith, genuine beliefs? What is it about the way in which religious communities function and organize that can play a role in the development process? And that's where academics can really pull that tugboat or be the tugboat pulling in a really, really interesting, fascinating direction that is genuinely relevant to the various different stakeholders, to use my good NGO language, involved. Yeah, I think I might stop there.
Great, thank you, Kathryn. And Lincoln, do you want to go next?
Sure. Yeah, so thinking about the question of how to improve knowledge exchange and collaboration, I think what Olivia said earlier really struck me, and I think it's a question we've talked about a lot, is that whole question of what is evidence. And I think the reality is my answer to that is going to be different from the policymaker's answer. It might be, there's nuances there, but it's going to be different. And the religious leaders that we've worked with also have a different answer to this. And I think that maybe before I thought, well, what's the perfect collaboration then? If everyone's, has a different perspective of what evidence is, how do we work together? And I don't think it's to let go of all the, all the background or all the justifications for why I see evidence in this way, or that this constitutes evidence. I agree with Katherine. We can't just insist and be unbending and not give up any territory at all and say that this is the only way to gather evidence. But I also wonder if there needs to be that creative space that allows all these different types of actors to work together without having to feel like we're giving up, this, maybe we've studied 10 years in a certain field and this is what I've been trained that evidence is, and to suddenly give it up to work with you, maybe that's too difficult. Maybe that's a jump too far. And I hope that there is a way to bind that together. And I mean, definitely have not figured out the solutions to that yet. But I do think that we still need to find that space so that we can be true to certain designs, because maybe certain methodologies have a reason, and true to certain lenses and angles and frameworks, because they all have justifications and thought and process behind it as well. But that I find it fascinating and interesting. So it's not a depressing kind of statement, but I think to think through how we can combine that and create the space to creatively engage together, that would be fascinating to work on. And I kind of wonder if that's one way that we can really improve these collaborations, is that, you can be okay, you can stick with your guns, that this is what evidence is. Don't worry, you can stay true to everything you've been taught, but we're going to meet in the middle, and this is the way we're going to do it. That kind of collaboration would be fascinating, instead of people feeling like they have to give up too much. The last thing I'd want is religious leaders that we work with to have to completely reframe the way that they think about evidence, and to have to think through scientific theory or think through hypothesis testing, because I don't think that's appropriate either. But I think to have everyone come together to the table with that depth of thought and that interest in working it out together, that could be fascinating. So.
Right, thank you so much, Lincoln. And over to Nora.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, I think that also we need to create the interest in this knowledge, first of all, as has been addressed a little bit before. Because it's not okay that a handful of people in many organizations are responsible to take care of subjects like religion or gender, and have to convince the rest of the organization that these issues matter. There's still so much bias to overcome, like Sarah mentioned too, and this needs to be addressed first. On the side of the knowledge itself, a lot is about making resources accessible, both financially, but also format-wise and language-wise. For example, the Religious Literacy Project at Harvard, they're doing work on translating very, very dense academic texts into accessible language for popular consumption. And they're focusing largely on conflict resolution and peace-building texts, but that could be something for development too. And then there are some development organizations that have set up their own bridges, like, for example, the UK Development Agency, back then called DFID, they had so-called help desks. I worked on one of them for a while with other academic researchers, and then you get a specific research question from the agency, and then you get, sometimes you get a week, sometimes just 24 hours of time to consolidate all available research that exists at the given time on this specific question. And then you feed that back to the agency. And it was hard for us to know to what extent the end product was actually used, but in theory, this approach sounds like a useful way to allow practitioners to build on all the existing knowledge in literature out there. Yeah, just 2 examples.
Great, thank you, Nora. And then we'll give the last word to Sarah. Last word in this round. We'll have some more time to talk after that.
Yeah, I think you guys have all made amazing points, Nora. I 100% agree. Accessibility is a huge issue. And if you're on the ground working in development, you just don't have time to read a 50-page report. You read the executive summary and the last paragraph, and then you miss all the great data because it's too long. And then we have to think about, if this research is meant to help communities, it has to be accessible to them. So for me, research needs to be much shorter, much simpler language translated into local languages. If illiteracy is a problem, it needs to be, there needs to be videos, there needs to be presentations, it needs to be usable. And then I would also really agree with what Katherine was saying, that it's got to be less about the personal interest of the researcher and much more about what needs to be done. And I would also say that that development agencies need to be coordinating better with each other, because I've sat in a number of cluster meetings where suddenly you see that three NGOs are doing the same research in the same area, and they never spoke about it. And suddenly it's like 3 different donor funds all competing. So on the one hand, I would say the different donors need to kind of stop this competition. You know, let's look at more collaboration between donors amongst common issues. NGOs need to coordinate better, collaborate. I also really strongly believe we need to collaborate more between local and international actors. There are a lot of amazing local researchers coming out who, for whatever reasons, lack the ability to engage with international research, could learn a lot from them, have local languages, local trust that they could give to international researchers. Like, there's incredible potential for collaboration there. And the 4th point is going to make me unpopular, but I'll say it anyway. But both development and academia are very elitist professions. They attract a certain kind of person, and it's, I mean, it's a fact that we have to be aware of, and it's something that I feel we all have an opportunity and a responsibility to try and open up. I think involving youth is a very important and good way to do this. And youth through research, as multipliers, as data collectors, writing reports, as translators, there's really great ways to get youth involved. So yes, I agree with everything my predecessor said and whatever I added to that. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you to all 5 panelists. We now have just under half an hour left. For more discussion, maybe people in the audience would like to ask questions to our panelists. Maybe they would like to share their own thoughts, add reflections. We have time for that now. I will hand over to my colleague Olivia, who is going to share this last part of the panel discussion.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, and thank you to all our panelists. It really reminds me that a lot of us in these pracademic type roles, a piece of jargon in itself, I guess, but that we're all working on a daily basis to be these brokers between worlds of jargon, between the religious, the development, the methodological research worlds. And that's everything from Nora's example of making track changes on a document to Anu's example of 3 months on a research design. We all have those types of examples. So this is the kind of the daily work and the practical work of the knowledge exchange. So I recognize that potentially everyone on this call has those experiences, and it's important work. We should, I ask you to pat yourself on the back for that. So I think we've got a nice amount of time for Q&A. I'm asking you to please raise your hands using the reactions function on the Zoom screen. I will then just go in order and ask you to unmute, and as you raise your hand, then ask your question. Please keep your question brief and actually phrase it as a question. So I see the first question from Eggert. Over to you, Eggert.
Thank you everyone for this very engaging panel discussion. Sarah, my question goes to you and picks up your last statement that academia and development are very elitist setups. And so what to do about it? And in a very pointed manner, maybe how to solve this in 3 easy steps, especially a bit tongue in cheek, but yeah, where would you even start?
Okay. Where would you where would you start? I'm feeling very put on the spot here. I could maybe begin with a program that I set up for myself. Well, I set up a program in Iraq, I'm sure you're aware of it, where I saw that there was a need for research. There was a need for research, and a research study would cost around $30,000, and we had a lot more needs than we had money to finance research. And at the same time, the Humboldt-University has a program on religion and culture with students who are perfectly capable of conducting research and have all the skills and are looking for meaningful research and a little bit of work experience. So we invited 7 researchers to Iraq to conduct their research, which we, and then of course the Humboldt-University, could use instead of getting a professional researcher for $30,000. So that was a way that we tried to involve youth in important research around religion, development, and culture, and make it accessible to them, which is hopefully going to help them in their later careers. But this is one very small intervention. I mean, to be honest, it kind of feeds into the bigger question of NGO salaries and local versus international packages. Yeah, involving, if you're going to be recruiting locally, then also paying locals an equitable amount. It's a very, it kind of gets to the core of the NGO industry, to be honest. Academia in countries that are not Germany is also very elite because you have to pay to go to university. So you kind of have to dismantle the academic system in a way. I mean, in Germany, you're very lucky that anybody can attend university with the right grades. I find the system in this country absolutely outstanding. So maybe some of my colleagues are better qualified to give a more comprehensive response than I can. I just see the problem and I try my very best to engage in my own small way. Thank you.
Yes, we've got.
I'm glad I put you on the spot. Thank you.
We've got another question from Tom and Caroline, but I will just say, does anyone else, do any of the other panelists want to speak to that? Because I'm sure it's something that you've all thought about as well.
Yeah, I'll just say that I agree with Sarah on definitely also on the financial point. There are these paywalls also on academic texts and those expensive journals. Just when you want to access any academic journal, you have to pay a lot of money to get to those texts. So it's just extremely exclusive to be able to consume academic literature. So that's something that makes it elitist in a way as well. And then also in a different way too, I mean, there are people who, when they write their papers now, they make an active choice to branch out of, you know, the Western bubble, if you will, and actively look for literature from other areas of the world. Or when you write about feminism, you can branch out of Western secular feminist voices and look for other feminist voices because they're all around the world. And so just branching out a little bit and and including more voices is also a way to make it less elitist. And there's a lot more to do internally for academia to bridge internal gaps, for sure.
Any other of our...
Could I come in very quickly, if that's okay? Mm-hmm. I think I'm really glad that Sarah talked about local researchers and we're talking about the financial issues. Another thing I think that's really important when you think about, you know, someone's very interested in doing a piece of research and who's guiding it. When you look at local researchers, if you look at the global south, there's lots of local researchers who are extremely experienced, who have a lot of research background, but they really don't have access to funds, right? And you know, prior to working in Christianity, I worked in Sri Lanka for a think tank, and the most difficult issue is that you know you're working within communities and you realize something that for which you need to build evidence base, but research funds for research either through development or through academia are all concentrated in the global north. It has to be a researcher based at a Western university. right? Or you're at the mercy of the IDRC being interested in studying something and then trying to slip your question fit your question into that. So that's something we can also actively do, not only as development practitioners, but also as academics, to say we need to change the structures, because there's no way to kind of challenge these dominant assumptions if researchers in the Global South aren't able to access funds to do research, or if you have to, be the research assistant to a professor in a northern university. This is very, very difficult. Quite often, there are experts who aren't able to do their own projects, and that's a real issue, I think. Thanks.
Thanks. What I'm going to do now actually is we've got 3 questions pending. So I'm going to invite the 3 questions in a row, and then we can turn to the panelists to answer the questions, as I see we only have about 15 minutes left. To the 3 people with questions, please make your questions brief and to the point. So first of all, we have Tom. Tom, you can unmute to ask your question.
I just have a question. Faith in the community cannot harmonize because their practices are different. Therefore, it becomes difficult to initiate a standard research. How can we go about this?
Thank you. So initiating research with different practices in the community. Then over to, I think it was Caroline next.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I could really feel also from a personal experience these divides you spoke of. And I'm still reflecting about how to overcome or how to create links, and just very concrete from my very young experience from the academic system, because I think there the problem starts when you first said that in academia or research, there are very good results, but you cannot use it as a practitioner. And then I felt that myself, but also other students, we reached out already in the bachelor or master to some FBOs or some other development organizations and ask for which research questions would be relevant for them, so that we could do our bachelor thesis or even master thesis. And there weren't the structures available for the side of the university. So they said you cannot have a supervisor which is outside the university academic system, and the other way around. So there already I felt that there's not a bridge, that there's not coming something together. And then as well as I continued, for example, I still feel like as a researcher, they say you have to stay neutral and you cannot be engaged as much as you were before, maybe in your religious community, or you decide to make this career profession in your religious community. So I'm very grateful that I found this platform, but I feel that it's very like an exception, at least from in my country context. So maybe in other country contexts, the boundaries there, it's there are less boundaries, or it's more fluid, because I still feel that at one point I have to decide, because of the specialization, either this academic career or you go in practice, in development practice. And I think that's such a pity, because I think we need multilingual persons, what you said, persons who can speak the language of maybe the religious people of the local communities, and people who can speak maybe the other language. And I feel from my experience, also from professors or researchers, that it's not multilingual as much as it should be, or maybe what would be fruitful.
Thank you. Yes, the problems of methodological agnosticism that's expected, this neutrality. So, okay, and then over to Philip.
Yeah, thank you very much to all of you for this exciting talk, really exciting contributions. I'm very much fascinated by everything that was said. I just want to raise 2 questions. The one is, if we want to make research more accessible, how do we facilitate quality assurance? How do we, isn't this, and phrasing it in a somewhat provocative way, isn't that a call for, kind of decoupling the research and the practice policy spheres, in-depth research where researchers really focus in depth, get some sort of results, and then they are communicated in an accessible way with the outside academia world. Second question, if we call for research to be more focused towards the interests of the policy and practice actors, don't we run the danger to produce more research that is what Jones and Peterson called instrumental, narrow, and normative, which already, is already criticized in the religion and development field? Also, Emma Tomlin mentioned this earlier.
Okay, so I'm passing back over to the panelists. We have questions on creating research within communities of many different faiths, university NGO research links and the difficulties of neutrality within or expected neutrality, and then Philip's final questions on quality and the problems of furthering the instrumentalization that we might critique ourselves. So you don't have to, panelists, you don't have to take all of those questions, but it would be good if we could have at least one answer to each of the questions. No particular order, so please just speak up if you feel you have something.
I can go. I want to answer all three, but I don't know whether I'll get there. And I think just briefly to the very first comment about harmonizing with local religious beliefs, I think that we do have a real issue of core values. The values of humanitarianism and the values of religion overlap so much, but they speak a different language and they sound different, and they are not identical. Sometimes we like to, I work for a faith-based organization, and sometimes we like to think it's just that we use different words, but we actually do believe the same thing. And that's not true. It's not identical, but there is massive overlap. And so I think just my quick answer to that question is that's why we need to have a really good dialogue and do good research so that we can figure out how to communicate, because it's very difficult on the surface, but it's very easy once you start digging, I think. And the question that's probably nearest and dearest to my heart is the question about the being an academic and a practitioner at the same time, because that's my world, it's my life. And yeah, maybe it's an issue of context. I've been very fortunate that my university is completely supportive, and my role at World Vision benefits a lot from my university identity. And so on both sides, I do have complete support, but I think that that speaks to the value, like you said, that speaks to the value of my university, and it speaks to the value of the NGO that hired me on and what they were looking for. But I think there's also an element of how we communicate. And I think because I've always been a sociologist of religion, and I am myself a professing Christian, and so I've always been studying my own people. In an academic community that tends to be quite anti-Christian, I've learned to explain and present myself in a way that is very a combination of maybe self-critical and questioning, and yet also not shirking away from my identity. And I think probably the person who has done the most for my academic career was one of my PhD supervisors, who was very, very anti-religion, who every time I came and I talked about something faith-based or religious in my PhD supervisors, she tore me apart. She said, that can't be right. That can't be true. I'm an empiricist. Religion isn't verified in empiricism. And for me to complete my PhD, I had to learn how to explain things to her and how to present my findings in a way that was true to my research participants, who were themselves people of faith, and yet also responded to her questions. And I think it can be done, and being in an environment that is very critical and suspicious can make us better at what we do. But yeah, it's also kind of choosing to work with the people who are willing to work with us. And I've talked long enough, so I'm going to leave the third question for someone else.
Thanks, Katie. I love that we probably all have some personal reflections on what it means to divide our identities somehow, sometimes. Any panelists?
Can I jump in? Is that okay? Sure. So yeah, thank you, Katherine, for sharing that. I think I relate to bits and pieces of it, and I think I'm really encouraged just to hear that as well. I think for myself, Caroline, your question about, where are the boundaries of academia and how do you navigate and find a role in the midst of all of that if you're interested in religion development and academia. So for me, I think I had to look around quite a bit to also find a postdoc. After my PhD, it was not easy to find anyone in the infectious disease epidemiology field that was too interested in supervising a postdoc that was also interested in connecting with local faith leaders. But I do think that at least, maybe it's not every university would be as open, or I shouldn't just generalize and say there's, universities as a whole, but I do think that you might come across closed doors, but I do think that there are open doors. And I think that it might not be as smooth as maybe some of the other mapped out career paths, but then I'm hopeful and optimistic that there's more and more, as we are thinking more multidisciplinary and as we're looking for more creative collaborations, I'm hoping that there is more and more space in traditional academia to think of things in a much broader and wider way. And with that, I guess I just wanted to touch on one of, I think, Philip's questions about quality. So all I can say is just my own kind of personal reflection and experience in this is, so I think when I was looking into working with a religious organization or a faith-based organization in development, I did kind of feel like maybe I'm at a crossroads. I should just choose that or choose academia. And it's really hard to find a place in both. But I decided to press on with that. And part of it, I think in the back of my mind was that question of quality. Not that I think that if I just dived into an NGO and only did NGO research, then I would give up all quality. But I think Katherine pointed to a really important thing was by keeping myself in a university where my colleagues do challenge my work all the time, I do appreciate that side. And I don't think this is the right setup for everyone, but that's kind of my personal reflection on quality is, I think there are these checks and balances in universities. And maybe that's just one example of a place where I have colleagues that are constantly challenging my quality, constantly challenging my methodology. And I find that to be positive, not a negative. And then I try to bring that to the NGO as well. And how do we kind of keep these coexisting pieces in harmony? That's part of the fun. But I think that's just my personal reflection is it's been, I think part of my quality is because I'm reaching across multiple domains and multiple actors. So.
We still have the question remaining on instrumentalization for anyone to pick up, but any of the other panelists on any of those questions as well.
I can say something briefly on instrumentalization. I agree with that concern. That's definitely a big concern I have too. I'm not sure I have the best answer, but in the meantime, rather than changing what we research and how we research it, I wouldn't want to change that just because because practitioners don't have the time or the scope right now. I wouldn't want to change that. It's more about how we translate that and what we offer, like more summaries or infographics or whatever is needed to just build that bridge a bit better. So just focus on the translation rather than the what and the how, rather than changing the actual research.
Yeah, I might just briefly come in on the instrumentalization piece as well. In my position at JLI, we are often approached to do pieces of research that are pretty predefined by the organizations that they're coming from, the NGOs or UN agencies. And there is the tension there of feeling, are we just answering or, that confirmation bias problem of they want a piece of research that's going to confirm something that they think they already know. And that's where, again, you really have to play that brokering position. And it's not just about, so if I was purely just doing my own research questions, I might be doing fairly esoteric research that maybe wasn't relevant to an NGO or a UN agency and wouldn't get their attention. But I have been approached by a UN agency, for example, with a question that they want to answer. And therefore you can step into that in a way that is true to what you know as a researcher and from academic principles of the integrity of your research, while also knowing that you're going to, and I think this comment has just been made in the chat, knowing that you're going to be providing a piece of research that does have impact because it's being commissioned, particularly to answer a question that they have. So it's a real balance, and I do feel the tension of that, feeling like we can't just produce exactly what has been demanded, because that is just, yes, instrumentalizing research for these predefined NGO purposes, but also there is an opportunity in it, in that you are able to bring, as we've all been discussing, this complexity of religion and development evidence to maybe NGO, UN circles, etc., that wouldn't have thought about it otherwise. But I know, I mean, I've worked with various people on this call before, and I know that in joint projects we've all gone through years potentially of track changes on reports, etc., to get to the final point of something that's acceptable for all. And there's always that push and pull between how can we really represent what is truthful to what we know in the academic research, but also going to be publishable because of all the risk averseness within NGOs putting their brand and their logo on a final report. And it's a constant negotiation. Yeah. I've taken up the last few minutes of time, but any final words from the panelists just before we finish? And great to see the chat as well. Thanks everyone for your additions there. Okay, well, on that note, we have hit the half-hour point, so I'm just going to take the opportunity to thank everyone for their contributions today. Thank you to our audience, thank you to our panelists, thank you to the organizers. It's been a really great session. We encourage these sessions, and I hope we can keep having them on a semi-regular basis almost, because it's so important to figuring out what we do in this religion and development space that is naturally between research and practice. So thanks to everyone, and I'm sure we'll continue to have a good rest of the conference.